I've been an officer of the law for over a decade, so I'm pretty familiar with authority trips and minor rule violators. But I never thought I'd see a so-called police force formed by a single overenthusiastic homeowner association board member. That was before Karen moved into my peaceful little neighborhood, bringing with her a personal security team that she treated like a private militia. Nobody saw it coming, and for the longest time, she had no clue that I'm an actual cop. Before we dive into this intense story, we have a small favor to ask. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far our stories reach. Thank you so much. Now let's dive in. I first got wind that something was off when I noticed bright orange violation tags stuck on my neighbor's doors. One neighbor, Mrs. Dell, had hung decorative chimes on her porch. Apparently, Karen decided noise pollution from wind ornaments was a serious offense. She threatened fines so high, you'd think Mrs. Dell had set up an illegal concert venue. Then there was Mr. Evans, who liked to fix old cars as a hobby. Karen's self-appointed officers barged onto his driveway, ordered he cease unapproved automotive activity, and scolded him for unsightly mechanical devices. It wasn't even an official homeowner association rule, but Karen insisted it was disrupting community appearance. All the while, I watched from a distance. I'd come home from my real police shifts exhausted, sweaty, from hours in a patrol car, and see Karen's so-called enforcers sneaking around. They wore uniforms suspiciously similar to actual law enforcement gear, black polo shirts with the words Neighborhood Patrol stitched in, white walkie-talkies at their hips, and cheap flashlights. They'd shine into yards at dusk. Despite the performance, all they really did was harass folks over trivial nonsense. At that point, I was mostly concerned for my neighbors. Karen hadn't yet turned her obsessive stare on me. That changed when I found a pink citation stuck under my welcome mat one afternoon right after finishing a night shift violation. Unapproved vehicle entry, it read, complete with a hefty penalty. The charge? According to Karen, I'd failed to stop at some imaginary checkpoint near the neighborhood entrance, one of her handmade signs that looked more like a yard sale leftover than an official note. I dismissed it as a bad joke. Real law enforcement sets no store by phantom checkpoints posted by a dictatorial homeowner association board leader. Days passed, and I kept ignoring that fine. The idea of paying for something so ridiculous was hilarious. If she had tried to enforce it through genuine legal channels, I would have heard about it from my department, or at least from the county offices. But everything was quiet on my end. Meanwhile, Karen carried on pestering other neighbors, a teenager who practiced with the garage band, an elderly couple who installed solar panels without her permission, a single dad whose kids drew chalk art on the sidewalk. She was an equal opportunity threat, and not a single soul was safe. Then one evening, after a brutal double shift, I drove home at dusk, wanting nothing but a hot shower and a good meal. The sight that greeted me, though, nearly made my jaw drop. Karen's squad had formed a barrier at the entrance to my driveway, standing shoulder to shoulder with flashlights raised. Their golf cart with warning light was angled diagonally across the pavement, blocking me from pulling in. Karen herself stood at the front, arms folded, a triumphant smirk on her face. Karen shouting, "Stop right there. You are in violation of Homeowner Association Code 11B. Failure to pay a legally issued fine. This driveway is now blocked until you settle your debt." I killed the engine, stepped out, and looked around at their Fox cop set up makeshift barricade tape, plastic cones, and a couple of handheld radios squawking static. It was all so absurd, I almost forgot I was mad. Me raising an eyebrow? Look, I've had a very long day. I'm tired, I'm hungry, and this is my house. That so-called fine of yours is nonsense. Move your equipment before this gets embarrassing. Karen tapped a laminated sheet she pulled from her clipboard. Karen, you owe $100 plus late fees. This is a recorded enforcement action. If you refuse to comply, we'll be forced to increase her. Officers nodded, glaring at me like they just cornered a bank robber. One guy stepped forward as if to physically stop me from walking onto my own driveway. That's when my temper flared. Me lowering my voice, "Listen carefully. I am a fully Sworn police officer, you have no power to block a private citizen's property over an invalid. Fine. Now step aside. The entire squad blinked in unison. Karen looked stunned, like she had just been told Santa Claus wasn't real. For a moment it was dead. Quiet. Apart from the rustle of wind in the trees, I could see the gears turning behind Karen's eyes. He's a cop. For real, Karen? Recovering fast. I don't care if you're the governor. Our neighborhood rules are to be followed. The board gave me full authority to enforce. I cut her off with a sharp gesture, my badge finally in hand. Me, your board does not override state or local law. Blocking someone's private property is illegal. So is threatening them with a fake police force. Now move. A tense showdown followed. Her volunteer enforcers looked to Karen for direction, but she just stood there, tensing, refusing to budge. My heart was pounding. I'm used to real confrontations, but this felt bizarre, almost ridiculous, if it weren't so infuriating. Finally, one of the men in Karen's group stepped away, opening a path. The others followed suit in awkward silence, and I was able to pull my car into my driveway. I turned around to speak to Karen one last time. Me? Any more harassment, any more phony tickets or attempts to block my property, and I will involve actual law enforcement. Do I make myself understood? She didn't say a word, just glared with all the hatred she could muster. Then she spun on her heel, hopped into the golf cart and muttered off, with her crew trailing behind. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, wondering what new trick she might try next. Because if there's one thing I've learned after years on the force, it's that people like Karen don't go down quietly. They push back. I headed inside, shoulders tense from the confrontation, but a small smile tugged at my lips. The whole neighborhood had suffered under Karen's bizarre rule for too long, and now she'd picked the wrong target. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to bring real order to this place and show Karen that her flimsy brand of oppression didn't stand a chance against actual law and justice. I'd hoped my confrontation with Karen that evening would scare her away, or at least convince her to stand down for a while. No such luck. What I didn't expect was the intensity of her revenge. An audacious move so hostile it left the entire neighborhood shocked and me angrier than I'd ever been. A couple of days passed quietly, with Karen uncharacteristically absent from her usual rounds of enforcement. I started to wonder if I'd finally gotten through to her. But then, early one morning, I stepped outside to grab my newspaper and nearly dropped it in horror. My patrol car, parked at the edge of my driveway, was covered in some sort of sticky, foul, odorous substance. It looked like a mix of paint, glue, and who knows what else. Yellow X marks were slapped all over the doors. In windshield and taped to the driver's side mirror was a note scribbled in bold red marker: "Pay your fines or find a new neighborhood." I felt my face flush with anger. It didn't take a detective to guess who was behind this, but the real gut punch came when I noticed the damage wasn't limited to my vehicle. Several neighbors' cars had been hit too, similarly vandalized with hateful messages about homeowner association compliance. One minivan had "No deadbeats" splashed across its hood in lurid pink paint. Mrs. Dell's door, once sporting those cheerful wind chimes, had been hammered with nails in a crooked grid, as if someone tried to seal it shut. I immediately snapped pictures of every bit of vandalism. My neighbor, Mr. Evans, came over, jaw clenched, pointing to fresh tire tracks on the road. Mr. Evans saw a truck last night around 2 in the morning. Didn't think much of it, but it wasn't anyone. I recognized they were spraying something. Thought it might have been pesticide or some advanced cleaning job. Now realize I should have called you. Me? Don't blame yourself. This is obviously planned. Karen's personal squad must have done it. I filed an official police report and passed my evidence along to a friend at the station. While I couldn't arrest Karen on the spot without solid proof tying her to the crime, it was only a matter of time before the truth surfaced. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was buzzing with outrage, fear, and a simmering hatred for the woman who'd gone too far. Word of the vandalism spread like wildfire. A few folks knocked on my door, furious and ready to act. One couple claimed they'd seen Karen's so-called officers Sneaking through backyards with flashlights hours after midnight, a single mom showed me a strange eviction notice taped to her garage, demanding she leave if she couldn't maintain proper standards. An older retiree discovered hateful flyers slipped under her windshield wipers, calling her lazy for not decorating her yard to Karen's liking. People had put up with her trivial nonsense, but physically damaging property and threatening to drive them out of their own homes, that was an entirely new level of cruelty. By mid-afternoon, neighbors were calling for a unified resistance. Some started drafting a petition to remove Karen from any homeowner association position she might still hold. Others demanded I, as a police officer, do something more immediate. Late that same day, I spotted Karen patrolling the main street in her golf cart, two of her followers riding along. They were handing out little leaflets, "Door 2. As soon as she saw me, she snapped her fingers at her squad to stop. She hopped out and marched straight toward me, eyes brimming with vindictive satisfaction. That night, I called a neighborhood meeting at Mr. Evans's house, making sure word got around. No official homeowner association business, just the real neighbors, the ones Karen was terrorizing. People showed up in droves. We stood shoulder to shoulder in his small living room. Mrs. Dell confessed she was scared to leave her house unattended in case Karen targeted it again. A local teacher revealed Karen had plastered humiliating signs around her yard calling her a manipulator of children. A father of two raged that Karen's patrol had flashed lights in his kids' bedrooms at midnight, claiming night inspection. The stories kept piling up, each more insane than the last. Folks turned to me, hoping I could wave a magic wand and fix it all. But as a cop, I had to follow rules. Evidence, statements, formal charges. Still, hearing their desperation left me angrier than ever. Karen wasn't just being petty or nosy. She was orchestrating a campaign of fear. She wanted control, and she wanted everyone submissive under her fabricated rulebook. Me quietly to the group, I promise you, we'll put an end to this. She's crossing criminal lines now. Vandalism, harassment, possibly trespassing. Let me gather everything and we'll take real action. A chorus of relieved murmurs followed, though the tension remained. Everyone knew Karen wouldn't back down unless she was forced. Fortunately, the law was on our side. She just didn't realize it yet. As I left Mr. Evans's house that evening, I passed by the still-marked patrol car in my driveway. The smell from whatever Karen had used was a harsh reminder of how cruel she could be. But I also felt a strange sense of determination. She wanted payback. Well, now, she was about to face real consequences. Karen's private police squad may have given her the false power, but they were no match for the actual rule of law. And once the neighbor testimonies, vandalism reports, and photographic evidence were all gathered and presented to the authorities, there'd be no golf cart on earth fast enough to help her outrun what was coming. Next, I decided right then and there if it took every last ounce of my influence as a police officer and every hour of free time my neighbors could spare, we'd bring Karen's rule of terror to a screeching halt. She'd picked this fight, and now, the whole neighborhood was ready to make sure she'd regret it. After I submitted a detailed report on Karen's illegal checkpoint harassment tactics and blatant trespass, my captain wasted no time in greenlighting the next step, a coordinated operation to put an end to Karen's pretend law enforcement. It wasn't just small neighbor drama anymore. Her acts now qualified as criminal activity, especially after she and her so-called squad blocked public roads and threatened residents. By this point, the neighborhood had become a powder keg. Every night, you could feel the tension growing. Neighbors anxious and waiting for Karen's next stunt. We all hoped she'd finally realize her act was over. Instead, she doubled down. Sure enough, late on a Friday night, while I was off duty, word got out that Karen's team was back at the neighborhood entrance. Flashlights sweeping across windshields, reflective cones creating a crude barrier. Several frantic texts buzzed my phone. Neighbor has one text there. Stopping cars again. Looks like 4 or 5 of them this time. Neighbor has 2 text. This is escalating. They tried to take my license plate info and threatened to fine me if I didn't show proper papers. I relayed the information to my captain, who quickly arranged for a couple of squad cars to move in. He told me I was clear to join the operation if I wanted. After all, I had first-hand knowledge of the entire situation. Without hesitation, I grabbed my badge and gear, hopped into my recently cleaned patrol vehicle, and headed down the street. We approached with lights off. About 4 blocks away, standard procedure for a situation that wasn't yet confirmed as violent, but definitely illegal. 2 squad cars pulled in behind me. Even from a distance, we could see the flashing hazard lights of Karen's golf cart and the orange glow of road flares marking her makeshift checkpoint. Officer Bailey, over the radio. Affirmative. That I see at least 5 individuals. Looks like they're stopping a red sedan right now. Captain, over the radio. All right, on my count. Keep it calm and orderly. We'll secure the scene first. I felt a knot form in my stomach, equal parts anticipation and anger. This was my neighborhood, my neighbors being harassed. But tonight, Karen wouldn't get to slink away. We rolled in with our flashers. On lighting up the street in red and blue, Karen's officers froze. One dropped his flashlight on the asphalt, casting wild shapes. Karen herself, dressed in a navy blue polo with neighborhood patrol embroidered on it, whipped her head around in fear. Captain stepping out of his squad car with a firm voice. Hands where we can see them. Everyone remain calm. This is the police. Karen's crew looked confused, torn between loyalty and common sense. 2 of them actually lifted their hands in the air, clearly fearful. Another tried to shuffle behind Karen as if using her as a human barrier. Me badge in hand. This operation is over. You're blocking a public road, detaining drivers without authority, and issuing fraudulent fines. I made direct eye contact with Karen, whose face had gone a furious shade of red. She clutched a clipboard as if it were a lifeline, her knuckles white. Karen, voice shaking, you can't arrest us. We have every right under the Homeowner Association Charter. Captain, interrupting your so-called charter does not override local or state law. You have no legal jurisdiction to set up roadblocks or demand compliance. Hands behind your back. Now, Karen hesitated, eyes darting around for an exit. One of her recruits tried stepping forward, perhaps thinking he could talk his way out of it, but Officer Bailey quickly instructed him to stand still. Another officer read Karen and her accomplice their rights. It was surreal watching them in custody, each looking more bewildered than the last. Karen is wild, lashing out verbally. This is harassment. I'm protecting the community. I'm me. Grimly. You've been terrorizing it, Karen. There's plenty of evidence. And now, we have you red-handed, running an illegal checkpoint. She glared at me like I was the villain himself, but said nothing more as the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrist. Within minutes, a small crowd gathered, watching, pointed toward the makeshift barricade, curious neighbors stepping out to see the spectacle. Some watched silently, others murmured with relief and justice. A few even clapped when Karen's squad members were escorted toward the squad cars. Mrs. Dell stood off to the side, tearful yet smiling, as if a weight had finally been lifted. Mr. Evans gave me a thumbs up, clearly grateful. People who'd been forced to stop at Karen's checkpoint moments earlier relayed their stories to the officers, detailing threats and demands to show proof of compliance. Just before being guided into the back of a squad car, Karen twisted her head around to shout one last rant in my direction. Karen venomously, you think you've won? I'll sue you for false arrest. I'll bring the entire homeowner association board down on you. Me? Calmly. Good luck with that. We have the law on our side. That was the last I heard from her as the car door slammed shut. Her underlings, still wearing those ridiculous neighborhood patrol polos, looked equally crushed, heads hanging. Some of them mumbled excuses or justifications to the arresting officers, claiming they didn't realize they were breaking the law, but ignorance wouldn't get them off the case. Tonight, as the police convoy pulled away, removing the road flares and orange cones, a palpable wave of relief washed over the neighborhood. People approached me, offering thanks and sharing stories about Karen's intimidation tactics. For weeks, they'd felt powerless, believing a shady homeowner association rulebook might hold more weight than common sense or actual law. I reassured everyone that the arrests were legitimate, backed by ample evidence of harassment, unlawful detainment, and careless conduct. In the coming days, they'd likely face multiple charges, enough to dismantle Karen's little regime for good. As the police convoy pulled away, removing the road flares and orange cones, a palpable wave of relief washed over the neighborhood. People approached me, offering thanks and sharing stories about Karen's intimidation tactics. For weeks, they'd felt trapped, believing a shady homeowner association rulebook might hold more weight than common sense or actual law. I reassured everyone that the arrests were legitimate, backed by ample evidence of harassment, unlawful detainment, and reckless conduct. In the coming days, they'd likely face multiple charges, enough to dismantle Karen's little kingdom for good. After that night, the neighborhood finally relaxed a long-held breath. Karen's house stood dark, her golf cart abandoned in the driveway, her patrol posters ripped down by whoever remained loyal to her cause, if anyone did at all. The Homeowner Association Board publicly distanced themselves, clarifying they never authorized any forced checkpoint or mandatory compliance measures. They tried to save face, of course, but I suspected there'd be legal consequences for them too. For the first time in a while, I came home from a shift and found true calm in the place I'd chosen to live. No more homemade tickets under the door. No more security guards shining lights into windows. No more anxiety lingering on every corner. Karen had misjudged this neighborhood, forgetting that real justice isn't a joke. And she and her crew learned that lesson the difficult way. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories like this.